My wife and I were traveling to the Smoky Mountains from Ohio on an anniversary getaway. We usually avoid highways in our travels and instead prefer the scenic and slower-paced state routes of my childhood. This trip stood out as quite a disaster, as we struggled with both the GPS and paper maps while navigating a route I was at least somewhat familiar with. Navigational errors are not our norm, and we quickly found ourselves having an uncharacteristic argument that got fairly heated, but was nonsensical. It was like we spoke different languages, and were looking at different maps. We eventually found ourselves in increasingly less populated areas and poorer road conditions. For those not familiar with the area, being in central Kentucky, the forest is hilly and expansive, dotted with small towns and the occasional privately owned farm amidst all the federal land. We had eventually quieted down, anxiously following the GPS as it cut in and out. Our anxiety grew until the GPS suddenly chimed in with, "Turn left now." I responded by reluctantly starting the turn, when my wife suggested it must be a shortcut we were unaware of. Upon completing the turn, I slowed, seeing the road took a sudden drop in quality. Potholes large enough to get a tire stuck in, overgrown scrub growth on the edges, and ominous gnarled vines hanging down. The hair stood up on my neck as it does right now while I write this. Bringing the car to a stop, I asked my wife, "Are you sure about this?" As I look towards her, "No, we need to turn around," and she starts to say, but is cut off, almost frozen, staring at her phone. Not in the way a person freezes when terror sends their muscles trembling, but completely motionless. I instinctively slam it in reverse, backing into the position we came, so that I could continue the course we were on. As we reached the end of our reverse turn, I slammed it into drive, but went nowhere as the rear of the early 2000s Lincoln is lifted off the ground. Before I could process what is happening, something charged from the woods to our right. At first, it was a large red blob that moved with a speed and grace that seemed unnatural to its grotesque nature. As it closed the gap, it was clear that it was running on all fours, but only partly so. Its forward movement was agile, but uneven, as it irregularly used its arms with its oddly bent hind legs. It was almost like its limbs were growing, as it eventually came to stand on its hind legs and place its hands on the glass of the window. Up close, I could see what I thought was fur. It seemed more like strands of rotten flesh that grew as thick as a shaggy dog and smelled overwhelmingly of rotten fish and moss. Its hands looked nearly human, were it not for the rotten fur and long claws. The face sticks with me as much as the smell, being somewhat shaped like a human that has its face twisted and pulled forward in a vague, canine shape, with large pointed ears towards the top of its head. Inside its snarling mouth were long narrow teeth that looked almost too large to close. But the eyes were the worst part. Bloodshot and yellow, they leered at my wife with a hunger. A kind of hunger that promises unspeakable things. When you're in flight or fight situations, you usually get that distinct moment of clarity where you make your choice, even if it's one you are ashamed of. In that moment, I felt like a small dog defending my mate from a rabid wolf. I stomped the gas pedal and bellowed hard, "We've got to go now!" And a series of loud noises that sounded more like barks than human noises followed. It jolted suddenly and the rear of the car dropped, leading to a large peel-out, and the creature kept pace with us, scratching at the car and banging on it until we broke 45 miles per hour, driving wildly through the winding country until we saw the lights of a town in the distance. We parked in a well-lit parking lot in the center of town next to a gas station. We busied ourselves as we inspected the car, reluctantly sharing what we thought we saw. She was in tears and sobbing about feeling a pressure in her head and that she was conscious, but paralyzed. Looking under the trunk, I spotted a cracked strut and a lump of the rotten flesh dangling from a frame member. The smell was still overpowering and sent us into a tear-filled hug as we stared at a piece of the filthy creature and realized it was likely at least two of them. The one in the window and the one that lifted the rear axle off the ground. Thoroughly shaken, we sat in the car facing opposite directions and discreetly unpacked our handguns and hid them under our blankets. We waited until 9 or so before setting back off towards our destination via highway. I've never really been a believer in the paranormal. I always try to find a rational explanation for the things I have trouble working out. At least, until last summer. I'm originally from New Jersey. I had decided to take my wife and kids for a vacation. We went to visit my in-laws, who have a cabin in the Canadian Rockies. For the first few days, we enjoyed the peace and tranquility of the country and went on a bunch of hikes and bike rides in the forest around the cabin, during which I didn't see anything out of the ordinary in what must have been a 20-mile radius around the home. The cabin is pretty old and runs a separate generator near the tool shed in the back of the yard, which my father-in-law says has always been temperamental and can create an eerie atmosphere when the lights flicker on and off. So I know better than to be spooked by shadows and bumps in the night. However, one night, around 10 p.m., we were sitting around about to go to bed when the lights completely gave out and the pitch blackness of the countryside meant that we could see literally nothing. Before I could grab the flashlight, I heard rustling outside the cabin and something brushed the side of the wall by the living room. I tried to put on a brave face for my kids and told them that it was probably a coyote and they should just go to their room. All the noises it made sounded bipedal and quite a bit bigger. Pretty creeped out, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to the generator, shining the light on the ground to find my way. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw something which terrified me. So much, I don't know if I can even find the right words to describe it. I couldn't make it out exactly. All I could see was a creature in my peripheral vision. It looked human and about 6 feet tall, with ghost white skin. I knew it was staring at me. At this point, I was mustering up the courage to look at it when I shined the light at it. I got a good look at the monster. It's so difficult to portray with words what it looked like, but it was like a man whose skin was too tight for his body. You could see all of his organs bulging through the skin and his bones. It made him almost look like an insect. And what jolted me the most was the fact that it had no face whatsoever, but still had indentations where the eyes should be. A bright light startled the creature and it hunched over as if about to run. This was all I could see in the brief glimpse I got before I dropped the flashlight in fright, and by the time I picked it up, it had darted into the forest. I ran back to the cabin and stayed there for what seemed like forever, making sure it had gone before I went back to the generator. I didn't tell anyone when I went back inside what I had seen. I don't really know why. I suppose to protect the children, and in case my wife didn't believe me. About a week afterwards, I started having a reoccurring nightmare. Every time I would dream about that night and wake up in cold sweats, until I finally confessed to my wife about it. I started seeing a therapist to help me with my sleep. I came across this website looking for other people with similar experiences. I have trouble finding accounts which match what I saw. I'd love to hear any stories about any people who think they have seen what I saw, or who have experienced getting over an encounter with the paranormal. It was the spring of 2006. I was just finishing up my freshman year of college, and a group of 5 of my friends decided to go into the woods for a bonfire. My friend Reed and I were bringing some beer. Another couple brought some hot dogs, and our 5th friend Alton was planning on coming a bit later in the evening because he had to finish up a paper and was going to bring more beer with him when he arrived. Reed, a couple of friends, and I hiked farther than we normally did. We found a good spot and lit our bonfire. I had a beer or two, and were working on cooking the hot dogs when Alton showed up. He didn't say much, and sat down next to me. We asked him if he wanted a hot dog, and he shrugged. But he did grab one of the beers I had brought earlier. Reed asked him if he had remembered to bring more beer, and he just looked confused. It was the end of the semester, and Alton wasn't a huge talker to begin with, so we just wrote it off. A while goes by. We're talking with the other couple, and Alton is a bit quieter than normal, but occasionally makes a grunt or some noise of agreement. It's starting to get a bit late, and I'm starting to think about heading home. Randomly, Alton throws his hardly finished beer into the fire. Quickly the beer heats up and spews out of the bonfire and hits me on my arm. At this point, Reed and I leave, after saying goodbye to everyone. It had gotten quite dark out, and finding the path is a bit hard. We finally decided just to walk in the direction of the campus, leaving the path behind. The forest is mostly new growth, so it's easy to walk. However, there are many small branches and small trees that can get snapped. Not long after we couldn't see the bonfire, we started to hear something following us. Snap, snap, snap. It continues for quite a distance. Reed is worried it's the police, but I'm worried it's something else. We decided to hide under a large tree and ditch our beer there. As we were on the ground, we started to see blue lights in the distance. They're swinging like someone is carrying them. However, they're maybe 7 foot in the air. The blue lights stay a few feet away and then slowly leave. They swing the whole time, as if they're looking for something. After what seems like a very long time, Reed and I decided we're safe enough and we should go back to campus. We ran the rest of the way down the hill and get to the upper parking lot. As we get to the parking lot, we see our friend Alton heading to the woods with some beer. We called out to him and he came over to say hello. I asked him when he had left the bonfire. I was kind of confused. He looked at us equally confused. Alton tells us that his paper took longer than expected. He's just heading out to the bonfire now with the beer he had planned on bringing with him the whole time. Reed and I are freaked out and decided to call it a night and just went home. I still think about this night. It was one of the oddest days in my entire life. Who did I have a beer with? I used to work at a cheese factory on the edge of a cornfield in southwestern Minnesota. I was working nights at the time. It was 2 or 3 a.m., and I was out on the loading dock, watching bats fly around the floodlights. I liked being out in the cool night air. The corn was about as high as my shoulder at the time, so about 5 foot 10 inches. As I was watching the bats, I looked down at the edge of the cornfield. Something was moving there. It was the size of a small child, and very, very skinny. Pale, with something that looked like a head of straight black hair. It moved in a sort of jerky gait, like someone dancing the robot badly. It moved in chunks, legs, then hips, and torso, shoulders, neck, and finally head. It was looking back into the cornfield, or at least I felt like it was. I felt prickly all over. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a heron or something at first, but it looked too much like a person. It didn't move like a person though. Gradually, step by step, it moved towards me. Letting my curiosity better my fear, I moved towards the edge of the dock, which was raised a few feet off the ground to connect with the semis. When I got within a few feet of the edge, the thing looked at me. I was paralyzed. I could have run, but I was stuck somewhere between terrified and intrigued. It started to move again, its face still pointed at me. It ratcheted its body in that disconcerting, jerky movement towards the cornfield and went into it. I tried to watch where the field moved as it passed, but the corn remained perfectly still. I also noticed that all the crickets were silent. After a few minutes, nothing happened. I stood out there for over an hour, but it never came back, and I never saw it again. I'm kind of glad.